Rudeness is not always external. Sometimes it lives inside the moment, silently, waiting for recognition, and it lands like a weight you can't shake off. You imagine you are composed, unaffected, observing calmly, but beneath its surface, irritation rises quietly, gnawing at your sense of control and patience. It is disturbing to realize that your reaction is not accidental, that your mind latches onto insult, amplifying it, replaying it, holding it like evidence of failure. Perhaps you think you are immune, that you can ignore offense. But the truth is subtle. The very act of noticing rudeness already changes you, shapes your response. You may even feel righteous in judgment, believing that their behavior is the problem, and that your calm is intact when something deeper is shifting within. And yet, if you watch closely, you may notice patterns repeating, moments of irritation replaying themselves, silently eroding your peace without conscious acknowledgement. Have you ever wondered why certain words, tones, or gestures pierce you, while others pass unnoticed, leaving an echo you cannot explain or dismiss easily? Because this is where things become uncomfortable. When someone is rude, you often imagine that your composure can neutralize the situation, that thought, effort, and restraint can preserve peace like a shield. You tell yourself that staying calm is a conscious skill, that your identity as a rational, unbothered person grants immunity against provocation, and this belief feels real. Every micro-expression, tone, or comment is analyzed, rehearsed, and predicted in your mind, as if understanding intention gives you leverage over the impact of their behavior. You believe that your reactions are choices, controlled, deliberate, and insulated from emotional contamination. Yet the tension suggests something slipping beneath your conscious grasp. You rehearse responses silently, crafting the perfect tone, imagining patience held firmly, and this careful anticipation creates a fragile sense of mastery over the insult. You notice yourself counting insults or perceived slights, cataloging behaviors to justify emotion, as if awareness alone ensures immunity, a subtle strategy to preserve self-image. Sometimes, you even rationalize the rudeness, framing it as temporary, external, or meaningless, comforting yourself with the illusion that impact is entirely within your control. The mind clings to this belief because it preserves identity, rational, composed, unshaken, capable of observing incivility without succumbing, while hiding the quiet friction that still persists internally. And yet, even as this narrative reassures, subtle unease remains, hinting that something vital has been overlooked, a force beneath conscious control quietly shaping every response. But to understand this fully, we need to look deeper. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Then the first crack appears, subtle but undeniable, when you realize that composure is not absolute, that rudeness still registers beneath the surface, shaping thought and feeling. It is disorienting to notice that restraint does not erase impact, that irritation lingers in micro-muscle tension, in fleeting thoughts, in mental replay of the interaction. You may start to doubt your own immunity, questioning whether your calm is a mask and whether control was ever truly in your hands to begin with. Even rational analysis cannot fully explain the visceral reaction, the slight pulse of anger, or the discomfort that rises despite deliberate observation and mental preparation. You notice how quickly annoyance returns, sometimes without warning, triggered by tone, glance, or gesture, and it hints at patterns deeper than conscious reasoning can reach. And in this realization, a quiet, unsettling truth emerges. Emotional impact is less a choice and more an interplay of perception, identity, and conditioned response over time. It feels like a fracture in the illusion you relied upon, a soft but persistent tremor revealing that calmness is not a fixed state but a fragile negotiation. This recognition unsettles identity, because the mind wants to see itself as rational, composed, and resistant. Yet evidence of subtle disturbance quietly contradicts that story. And once this first crack widens, it leaves lingering questions. What has shaped these responses, and why do they persist despite intention and awareness? The brain is a pattern-making machine, constantly learning which stimuli are threats, which words carry weight, and which gestures trigger physiological responses automatically. From early experiences, the mind encodes cues of disrespect or rudeness as signals to protect self-image, safety, or status, embedding reactions long before conscious thought arises. Even subtle dismissals teach neural pathways to react, to tighten muscles, raise heartbeat, or flare irritation, and these patterns are reinforced every time similar behavior is encountered. You may have noticed how certain voices, tones, or familiar insults provoke immediate discomfort, even if logically you know the person's intent is irrelevant or harmless. It is survival psychology at work. Rudeness registers as a potential threat to social standing or emotional equilibrium, triggering responses designed to protect and defend automatically. Consider a colleague's sarcastic remark, the immediate tightness in the chest, the mental replay of words, and the subtle desire to retaliate all happen below conscious awareness. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. Over time, these conditioned responses create a kind of emotional inertia where past experiences prime you to react before reasoning can intervene, making calmness feel fragile or artificial. Even attempts at mindfulness or rational observation often collide with deeply ingrained neural patterns, because the brain has encoded subtle cues as signals demanding response. This is why some people feel perpetually provoked despite intention. Attention, perception, and reaction are partially automated, shaped by repeated conditioning, survival instincts, and prior experience. And it is here in the architecture of conditioned response that we begin to understand why staying unbothered feels so elusive, yet so compelling. When you're ready, I can continue with Section 5, the hidden payoff, and Section 6, the identity trap next. Do you want me to continue? Beneath the surface of irritation lies a subtle, often unrecognized reward, a quiet confirmation that your boundaries, ego, and sense of self are still active and engaged. Rudeness triggers awareness, drawing attention to what matters most, reminding the mind of identity, values, and the invisible line between respect and neglect that defines personal space. There is a comfort in indignation, a silent reinforcement of self-perception as principled, sensitive, and morally attuned, and it feeds quietly into ego without conscious permission. Even subtle annoyance can feel like evidence of clarity, an internal proof that you notice injustice or imbalance when others might remain passive or unaware. Sometimes, the mind clings to these micro-rewards, replaying offenses silently to validate awareness, reinforcing the cycle of frustration while simultaneously satisfying a hidden need for recognition. The discomfort is not entirely negative. It functions as a confirmation of identity, preserving a sense of self that feels observant, vigilant, and morally awake in the social landscape. Consider the moment a stranger cuts in line, irritation rises. The mind catalogs the transgression, and a sense of moral authority quietly asserts itself without anyone noticing outwardly. Even when consciously letting go, traces of satisfaction linger, a quiet reinforcement that boundaries exist, and that the mind is aware of social order and violation simultaneously. This subtle emotional payoff explains why logic alone cannot dissolve disturbance. The mind benefits unconsciously from maintaining tension and awareness, perpetuating the pattern quietly. And yet, this reward comes at a cost, shaping identity and perception in ways that remain invisible until reflected upon, hinting at a deeper layer of self. Over time, reactions to rudeness become part of identity, not merely a response, but a defining lens through which the world and social interactions are filtered. You begin to see yourself as someone who notices, someone principled, someone who cannot be ignored, and this identity protects ego but also strengthens sensitivity to offense. Logic becomes ineffective because the behavior is no longer external. It is now entwined with the sense of self, defended automatically against perceived threats and challenges to moral order. Even attempts at detachment feel like a challenge to identity, provoking subtle resistance, rationalization, or defensiveness designed to preserve consistency between self-perception and experience. The mind has anchored meaning and value in noticing offense, in standing apart from indifference. And this reinforcement becomes self-perpetuating, embedding sensitivity deeply into personality. Consider the person who prides themselves on patience, yet cannot resist replaying minor slights in thought. Identity protects ego while perception remains primed for offense. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading they recognize themselves in it. This trap is particularly insidious because attempts to educate, persuade, or consciously correct responses collide with identity itself, producing resistance stronger than any rational argument. And the more you insist on composure, detachment, or emotional control, the more embedded these reactions become, revealing that staying unbothered is not a skill, but a profound psychological negotiation. What if being unbothered is never about ignoring rudeness, but about seeing it as a reflection of patterns, motives, and invisible forces that have nothing to do with you personally? This perspective shifts the weight of offense, transforming perceived attacks into data, subtle signals to observe, rather than threats demanding reaction, control, or moral judgment. You begin to notice that irritation is not proof of weakness, but a lens showing where perception, expectation, and identity collide with external behavior. Rudeness becomes less a weapon and more a mirror, revealing the interplay between your mind, conditioned responses, and habitual emotional triggers, quietly teaching awareness without overt struggle. Even the sharpest insult loses its power when reframed because meaning is no longer imposed automatically, but recognized as a mental construct interacting with patterns of perception. You start to see how expectations amplify offense, and how detachment is not suppression, but recalibration of perception. An understanding that control over meaning is partially an illusion. Every interaction becomes a study in dynamics, attention, projection, and response intersecting in unpredictable ways, and the mind begins to track them with subtle curiosity rather than resistance. Calm rises not from denial or repression, but from insight, the gentle recognition that perception shapes experience more than external behavior ever could, quietly altering internal narrative. And in this quiet observation, frustration loses its urgency, replaced by subtle awareness of rhythm, cause, and response, creating a space where unbothered composure is natural rather than forced. This perspective does not demand change or effort. It invites reflection, subtle recalibration, and a patient observation of patterns previously mistaken for personal attack. And yet, the transformation is almost imperceptible at first, a soft shift in attention and interpretation that quietly alters experience without dramatic effort. The quiet shift occurs when awareness deepens, subtle enough that composure is no longer practiced but emerges spontaneously. A calm grounded in perception rather than discipline. You notice micro-reactions fading, tension in thought and body easing, and the mind observing patterns without immediate judgment or emotional investment, allowing space for perspective to settle. Even silence becomes meaningful, no longer a threat to ego, but a canvas on which attention and understanding move without insistence. revealing nuance that was once invisible in irritation. Subtle cues that tone, glance, timing are now observed without amplification, interpreted as part of the flow of interaction, rather than evidence of disrespect or threat. Dissolving automatic reactivity, composure becomes less effort and more presence, attention less defensive and more exploratory. And even the sharpest provocation can pass without triggering the habitual spiral of judgment. You begin to feel the rhythm of perception aligning with observation, noticing emotional reactions as signals rather than verdicts, and the mind gains subtle freedom from automatic offense. This is not instant mastery but a gentle recalibration, where awareness replaces resistance and curiosity replaces insistence, allowing the psyche to settle without losing sensitivity entirely. Even habitual patterns of offense recognition now appear as data signals to observe and reflect on, rather than judgments demanding validation or retaliation, producing quiet, sustainable calm. And in this space, the mind experiences subtle autonomy, a quiet composure that feels earned through reflection rather than imposed through effort or struggle. It is in these micro shifts that staying unbothered stops being a skill and becomes a natural consequence of awareness, observation, and subtle internal recalibration. And this is where the final mirror begins to appear, reflecting not behavior, but the mind itself. Now look inward and notice how much of irritation comes from expectation, identity, and the mind insisting on control, rather than from the rude words themselves. Every micro-reaction, every tightening thought, every mental replay of offense becomes a mirror showing patterns of perception, unconscious assumptions, and habitual investment in imagined disrespect. You begin to see that offense is less an external fact and more an internal narrative, shaped by prior experiences, conditioned responses, and subtle ego mechanisms. Even calmness now reflects effort, identity, and expectation, revealing that staying unbothered is a reflection of internal architecture, not just a reaction to behavior around you. It is unsettling to notice how quickly mind and ego assign meaning, amplify insult, and replay offense, creating a landscape of irritation that feels external but is largely internal. You realize that the people you encounter are often catalysts, not causes, and that the mind constructs offense before consciousness can intervene or rationalize meaning. Silence, disrespect, and rudeness now become mirrors, reflecting your patterns of attention, perception, and emotional investment, providing insight rather than judgment, and revealing subtle autonomy in observation. And in this mirror, you see both the habitual reactions and the potential for quiet composure, a reflection that leaves space for awareness, choice, and observation without struggle. You notice a subtle gap between stimulus and response, a quiet interval where presence can emerge naturally without effort, and where unbothered composure becomes visible as process rather than goal. And in that space, irritation loses urgency, control becomes optional, and reflection replaces reaction, leaving the mind quietly observing itself in the social currents it encounters. There is no definitive end to provocation, rudeness, or disrespect. The world will continue to test perception, boundaries, and identity in ways that cannot be fully controlled. What changes is awareness, observing patterns, noticing reactions, and understanding that offense is largely constructed internally, leaving subtle space for calm and autonomy in thought and feeling. Curiosity replaces judgment, observation replaces insistence, and reflection becomes the rhythm through which the mind navigates insult without erosion of peace, identity, or emotional equilibrium. And so, staying unbothered is not a skill to acquire, but a subtle shift in perception, a quiet recalibration that emerges slowly and naturally when observation precedes reaction. Perhaps in the next encounter, in the next slight glance or tone, The mind will notice without amplifying, observe without defending, and respond without surrendering. Calm, quietly embodying presence. And this is where the story pauses, not with resolution, but with space to observe, reflect, and watch how the mind moves through provocation, silently learning its own rhythm.